But the municipal bond market in the United States is close to $3.6 trillion. That's with a T, not a B. And lately, the municipal bond funds that held Puerto Rico bonds have been shedding our bonds to where perhaps they hold no more than 60% of the total debt. So the Fed has said that Puerto Rico, if it defaults, it does not create a systemic problem. In a way, I guess, justifying no direct intervention and helping us find a solution. The third slide will show you that the study looked into the history of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department. And given this historical framework, examined possible federal actions with respect to Puerto Rico's debt problem. Specifically, the study examined the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and Federal Reserve regulations. Puerto Rico is part of the second district of the Federal Reserve System, which includes New York State, parts of Connecticut and New Jersey, as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. In any crisis, there are three basic questions that should be answered when considering intervention by the federal agencies. Firstly, from a policy perspective, is there precedent to intervene? Secondly, whether they have the capacity to do it, legal and financial. And thirdly, whether they have the tools that are required. Three very simple questions. The fourth slide will show you what the study revealed as actions taken by the federal government in the past as they considered and responded to different crises. Going back to the 70s with New York City, when loans were granted to the Municipal Assistance Corporation that was led by Mr. Felix Rohatyn at the time. I was a young, very young president of the Government Development Bank during that crisis. And the objective was to take the city out of financial distress. Afterwards, with developing nations, such as Mexico and Brazil, and I happened to have been in Brazil at the time, with the Brady bonds, named after the Treasury Secretary, Nicholas Brady, at the time. And with private sector entities, such as Chrysler in 1979, with loan guarantees, and more recently with AIG, with billions of dollars in loans. You probably recall the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP, in 2008 to save Wall Street and the automobile industry. In all, TARP invested about $700 billion in distressed assets to avoid precisely defaults, prevent foreclosures, and restore growth to the economy. Granted that in the cases of Detroit and Jefferson County, Alabama, two state entities, one a city and the other a county, the federal government did not provide direct assistance to any of them. So moving on to slide 5, the study concludes then that from a policy perspective, there are several lessons to be learned. There is flexibility in interpreting statutes and regulations. There are actions expressly allowed by law, but more importantly, there are actions that could be taken that are not prohibited by law. In special circumstances, legislation has been obtained from the Congress, all of which leads us to conclude, and it's what I would want you to take away with you today, that when there's a will, there is a way. If the federal government wants to help Puerto Rico, it can. How? So we go on to slide 6. If there are precedents for federal government intervention during financial disruptions, if the federal government has the capacity to intervene and has the tools that are required to do it, the questions then are, what can the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department do to support local decision makers in their pursuit of good economic and fiscal outcomes for Puerto Rico? What types of action are allowed by existing statute and regulations? What policy tools are available that could be applied in the case of Puerto Rico? To name a few, under Section 14.2 of the Federal Reserve Act, the Fed could purchase short-term notes up to 6 months to provide liquidity to the central government. This will help the central government solve the immediate liquidity problem that we read about every day in the paper, and that has pushed them to announce a possible reduction in the work week for all government employees. The Puerto Rico government was unable to sell in the marketplace the tax revenue anticipation notes, which we call the trans, as it had done every year for the last 20 years that I can recollect. And that created a significant liquidity problem that we read about it in the papers every day. As recent as last week, when they announced they were going to run out of money in November. Under this same section,